that would mean that after midnight it's nothing. So again, the impact of this is very, very small because the practical impact, first of all, would only be up in terms of the heavenly ledger, because either way, you're going to try to say Kriya Shema before Chatzos. If you miss Chatzos, you should say it anyway, because it can't hurt. So it has very little impact on your practice. And even for the heavenly ledger, it doesn't seem like there's anyone who really thinks that you're not Yotzei after Chatzos, because the one Rishon who says that within an opinion that he doesn't follow. So it was very controversial. Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva against this Rabbeinu Yonah, and the Shagas Aryeh earlier had a whole discussion about it, but the impact is very narrow. So it's not clear whether this Gezerah exists, but it basically means that Rabbeinu Gamliel and Chachamim really are on the same side. They really have the same conceptual understanding of Kriya Shema, that it's all night. And Rabbi Eliezer is on the other side, that it's the beginning of the night. And so we don't follow him, we follow the all-night view. And just a question of practically what that means. So that's not the source of so much controversy. What the source of a lot of controversy is, and we'll just go for a few minutes, normally we'll finish 9:45, time we start a little late, so we'll go for a few minutes. So the opening Machlokes Rishonim, the first debate that the Rishonim have in the beginning of Shas, is the question of, what about the opening time? Right, that gets kind of swallowed up in the whole discussion here, because so much more real estate is given to the question of when you finish Kriya Shema. But this opening time is a problem, because according to the Mishnah, if you know how to read it, obviously it's complicated, but if we figure out what this Kohanim thing means, so the earliest time you can say Kriya Shema is when it's fully dark outside. So as we know, very often we daven Ma'ariv, and it's earlier than that. We try to daven Ma'ariv, for example, when we daven Mincha Ma'ariv together, so we try to daven Ma'ariv after Shkia. But Shkia is not Seis HaKochav. So that's also too early. And sometimes we daven Ma'ariv even before Shkia. In our practice, we usually only do that on a Friday if we're bringing Shabbos in early, but it's not inconceivable that they would daven even before Shkia completely. And why are we reciting Kriya Shema then? How are we addressing this issue that the Mishnah seems to say that Kriya Shema has to be after it's fully dark? And this is not a new question. Sorry?
This question is based on just practice?
Yeah, it's based on practice, but it's not a new question, because in the Rishonim all talk about it. And as you can imagine, for the Rishonim it was a bigger issue, because the Rishonim didn't have artificial lighting, they didn't have street lights, so nobody wanted to be out at night, so they had a bigger motivation to daven Ma'ariv while it was still light outside and then to get home for the night. And therefore it was even more the practice then that they're davening early. And the Rishonim all discussed the question, so what's going on? So how is it that Kriya Shema is recited at this early time? So this is a big discussion. We'll talk about it for a few minutes. We might continue it a little bit next week, but it's very impactful in practice also. So there are many different views on the Rishonim. It's a big fight between Rashi here and Tosfos here. And la halacha, we follow neither of these. Neither Rashi nor Tosfos reflects what we actually do, which is a third view. And Rashi, there are two questions to answer. One question is, do we fulfill the mitzvah of Kriya Shema when we say it in shul when it's early? And if not, then we have another two questions. So why do we do it? Why do we bother saying Kriya Shema if it's not going to fulfill the mitzvah? And secondly, so what do we do about the mitzvah? So when do we fulfill the obligation? So Rashi's view, if you look at the second Rashi, so the middle of the second Rashi, okay, now look in the middle. It's the second smaller line, second thinner line. Before this time, Nami Lav Zman Shchiva. That's not called a time of lying down. As we alluded to before, it's a question, what does it mean when the Torah says lying down time and waking up time? Is this poetic references to night and day, or does it have a different definition? Maybe it's not even subject to how we define night, it's sleeping time, which might mean a different parameter. So whatever it is before this time, before it says Kochavim, is not considered to be a sleeping time. Not considered to be as man shchiva. So somebody who says Kriya Shema before this time is not in fulfillment. So then here's the big question. Right, so then why do we say it in shul when it's still light outside? It's interesting, you could maybe even understand from this Rashi that they always only daven at daytime, because it's if he says, well, if we didn't shul, it means it's daytime, that they never went out at night. So why do they say in shul when shul means it's going to be still daytime, because no one's going to be out in the streets without any street lights. So lama karnas habeis hakneses kidei la'amod b'tfila mitoch divrei Torah v'hachi tani b'reisa Brachot Yerushalmi. That essentially his understanding is that the role of Kriyas Shema at Ma'ariv when we daven early is like Ashrei. When we daven Mincha, we say Ashrei first, and that's the role Kriyas Shema performs at night. That when it comes to davening in general, so there's an idea that davening should be in the context of Divrei Torah. So what that means is a little bit of a careful balance. The Mishnah, the fifth parak of Brachos that we'll see eventually, Mishnah says there's a certain mindset that we're supposed to be in when we daven. Let's follow. We shouldn't get up to daven when we're in certain types of non-conducive mindsets. So we shouldn't be in a frivolous mindset. We shouldn't be joking around. Or we shouldn't be too depressed. We shouldn't be in a couple of different ways. So we have a section of the Divrei Torah to settle us, to get us in the right frame of mind. At the same time, we don't want it to be a ktsos. We don't want it to be like some complicated lumdus that's going to be distracting us, so that we'll be trying to figure out the sugya while we're in the middle of davening. So we want it to be something Torah-dic, but not something that's going to be too complex or involved. So something like Ashrei, that serves our purpose very well, especially because there's also a concept the Gemara is going to tell us we should say Ashrei 3 times a day. So it works out well. We say Ashrei from Mincha, it serves that purpose. But the other tefillos also need something like that. So Kriyas Shema doubles as that. So we say Kriyas Shema at Ma'ariv time, it serves that purpose, even though we're not in fulfillment of Kriyas Shema. Now, what's very interesting is that Rashi doesn't give a more obvious answer. There's another role that Kriyas Shema plays, and that's a whole intricate discussion as to how this works. We have a rule of smichas geula v'tefillah, that we want that there should be a segue. We go right from Kriyas Shema into Shmona Esrei, and really it's Berchos Kriyas Shema, the whole structure should go right into Shmona Esrei. We say Gal Yisrael and go immediately into davening. So we have this concept for Shacharis, for sure. And Shacharis, the whole discussion, we'll get to it later, we take it much more seriously. We don't allow any kind of interruption, we insist upon it. It's a much bigger deal when it comes to Shacharis. When it comes to Ma'ariv, though, the Gemara says that this is true for Ma'ariv also. We should also have Smichas Geula Tefillah. We should have the Kriyas Shema, Berchos Kriyas Shema situation, and then get into Shmona Esrei. So one could say that's why we do it. We daven the way we do Ma'ariv, even if it's too early, because we want to have the whole Smichas Geula Tefillah structure. We want to go from Gal Yisrael into Shmona Esrei. That should be a good enough reason.
We couldn't possibly say the Brachot Kriyas Shema without Kriyas Shema. No.
So that we apparently couldn't do. But what it might be the answer is there are some poskim who maintain that you have to be fulfilling Kriyas Shema at the time when you're doing this, which affects a couple of things. We don't seem to follow that, but there are some who felt it on the go and others who felt that was the case. So maybe if it was not yet a time for Kriyas Shema, maybe we can't even fulfill Smichas Geula Tefillah. So that's a whole complex discussion. But it's very possible that you can, so that should also be a justification for davening Ma'ariv in the normal format, the way we do, even if it's not yet fully dark. And again, as we said before, so Berchos Kriyas Shema are subject to the rules of Tefillah. So if it's time for Ma'ariv, so then you can say Berchos Kriyas Shema, even though it's not yet time for Shema. So that's not so striking to say that you can fulfill Kriyas Shema, you can fill a Berchos Kriyas Shema at that time, even though Kriyas Shema itself is essentially just Talmud Torah. It's just psukim that we're reciting for the sake of learning. It does not have fulfillment of the status of Kriyas Shema. So that answers one question. That answers, according to Rashi, the question of why do we bother saying it? But there's another glaring question, and that is, so when do we fulfill the mitzvah? There's a mitzvah in the Torah to say Kriyas Shema. When do we fulfill it? So Rashi says, don't worry, I've got an answer for that also. So, Lefika, chova aleina lekrosa misha techshach. So therefore, it's an obligation for us to repeat Shema when it gets dark. Now, had Rashi stopped there, he would not be controversial. Because I said before, we don't follow either Rashi or Tosfos. If that was the last line, we do follow that. So that would be okay, and that's what we actually do. We advise people, Friday night we daven early, we say when you get home after whatever time, 6:22, after it's fully dark, so say the 3 paragraphs of Shema. Parenthetically, by the way, it's Machlokes Moshe Feinstein at the Tshuva, where he notes there are two equally valid traditions about whether you should repeat the brachos or not. So I think most of us have a practice just to recite 3 paragraphs, but there's also an opinion to recite the brachos. It goes into that whole question of what role the brachos are fulfilling. It's interesting, actually. The Rush over here quotes of Amram Gaon that he maintained, no one does this, but he maintained that if you say Kriya Shema outside the structure of the brachos, you should recite a bracha asher kidshana mitzvosa v'tzivanu al mitzvos Kriya Shema. That it does need a bracha, and that the brachos Kriya Shema double in that role. And if you're saying it outside that context, you should make a separate bracha on it. So that's not our practice, but that says something about what's going on. So had Rashi stopped there, he'd be the winner. That's what we do. But Rashi starts a whole controversy by going further. And he says, not only should you say it after it's dark, but we'll save you some time. You know how we can do it? With a kriyas parsha rishona, sha'adam korei al mitaso yatsa. So when you say kriyas malamita, which is just the first paragraph, you're done. So this, by the way, is the source why many later Sfarim assume that Rashi's opinion is that the mitzvah min Torah of kriyas Shema is just the first paragraph. So we think of that whole discussion at different levels. So maybe Rashi is saying that just the first paragraph, that's enough for the mitzvah of Kriya Shema. So Tosfos does not like this at all. With all due respect to the grandpa, he doesn't agree at all with what Rashi is saying. And he has essentially 4 questions. So we're going to discuss, God willing, next week, what approach Tosfos takes. It gets into some complex territory. So we'll leave on a cliffhanger for that. But just to understand why he doesn't like Rashi's view, so he has a number of questions. One of them's hard to understand. He says, but it's only the first paragraph. Now clearly Rashi knows that, so that's not going to be like a bomb question. So clearly Tosfos is not satisfied with the first paragraph, which is some reflection of some difference. But it's hard to argue that that's some kind of a surprise attack that Rashi wasn't expecting. Clearly Rashi says reading the first paragraph is enough, and Tosfos said, but it's only the first paragraph. So they're talking past each other on some level as far as that's concerned. But so that's one of the objections Tosfos has. Second objection he has is that it's outside the context of the brachos. That bothers him also. A third issue that he has is that what about smichas gula tefillah? So we said before that we assume that there should be smichas gula tefillah for Ma'ariv. So what that means in the context, the way the Gemara discusses it later on, is that there were 2 possibilities. There was an opinion that we don't follow, that we shouldn't do smichas gula tefillah for Ma'ariv, which means that it would have been what the Gemara calls tefillos be'emtza tiknun, that the Shmona Esreis will all be in the middle. We'll have Kriya Shema in the morning, then we'll have Shmona Esrei for Shacharis, Shmona Esrei for Mincha, and Shmona Esrei for Ma'ariv, and then a Kriya Shema afterwards. So there'll be Kriya Shema in the beginning and the end, and all the tefillos will be in the middle. But we don't follow that. We follow the other opinion that Ma'ariv should have the same structure as Shacharis, Kriya Shema, and then Shmona Esrei. So says Tosfos, Rashi, according to you, you're throwing out the conclusion of the Gemara. You're saying that no, we're not going to have Shema then Shmona Esrei. We'll have Shmona Esrei then Shema. We'll say Shmona Esrei, and later on we'll fulfill Shema later. So that doesn't make him happy either. And the fourth issue he has, a little mysterious what the problem is he points out that later on, Kriya Shema Lamita, we don't really assume that's a real mitzvah min Torah or really anything like it. Kriya Shema Mita, is it even a din d'Rabbanan? It's not so clear. It's something the Gemara says that you should do for protection. That it's a good way when you go to sleep, you should say Kriya Shema. And the Gemara says that Talmid Chacham doesn't have to. If a person is already involved in learning, so he's learning other psukim, so that would also be good. So if you're doing something else, that'll also work. So what the nature of this question is not clear. Some of the later Svarim understand. Tosfos is saying that it's not so clear that everyone does this. It's not so clear that it's even necessarily an obligation. So to say that's how we fulfill the mitzvah min Torah of Kriya Shema is unsatisfying. So Tosfos says, I don't like anything that's going on with this. So Tosfos has a whole different approach based on the premise. It's interesting just in terms of the dynamics of debate here. So Tosfos really argues on Rashi's premise. Rashi's premise is you're not Yotzei in Shul, you have to be Yotzei later. So Tosfos' argument is really on the premise. Tosfos says, no, you are Yotzei in Shul. But he gets to that by arguing on the backup plan. So he says the backup plan doesn't work, so therefore you are Yotzei in Shul. So it's a strange way of arguing, because you think if you want to debate, you should debate the premise itself, not the backup plan. So it could be that he's arguing from practice, that since the backup plan is no good, so there must be some explanation as to how we deal with this, so it must be that you are Yotzei Shul. Doesn't work for the Mishnah, that's our cliffhanger. So what is Tosfos getting at? How is it that you are somehow magically Yotzei Shul when it is before dark? So that's something that we'll have to see, God willing, when we pick up next week. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to the hosts and to our challenge providers and providers.